Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a Prager U video, this one on the 10 Commandments. And do you know what? I've done a number of videos covering people talking about the 10 Commandments, and something I've noticed is that most of them are trying to argue that the 10 Commandments are necessary for a smoothly functioning modern society, but I don't think I've ever seen a video that actually lists what all 10 of the commandments actually are in their 10 Commandment videos. Maybe an image with the complete set flies by as they talk about prohibitions against murder and theft, but they never actually go into any detail. It's almost like they know that half of them are garbage, or that the different denominations list different commandments as the 10, so which 10 are the 10 can't even be agreed upon. Though, even considering that, I have yet to see any church even acknowledge the existence of the 10 Commandments that the Bible actually labels the 10 Commandments. Those are the ones from Exodus 34, which contain such important commandments as not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk. I wonder if Dennis will actually read the commandments that he's using in this one. Let's go!
No document in world history so changed the world for the better, as did the 10 Commandments.
I would be inclined to argue that the Code of Hammurabi, on which the Hebrew laws were based, was more important than the 10 Commandments foundationally speaking, but there is certainly no denying that a key portion of the scripture of a religion that had a massive impact on the world is at least linked to that impact.
Western civilization, the civilization that developed universal human rights, created women's equality, ended slavery, created parliamentary democracy, among other unique achievements, would not have developed without them.
I would argue that these things developed in spite of them. None of those things are mentioned in the 10 Commandments. Well, no, that's not entirely true. Slavery and women are both mentioned in the 10 Commandments. Does it say to treat women as equal or to not keep slaves? No, it actually tells you not to covet your neighbor's stuff, and lists his wife and slaves among the possessions of his that you're not allowed to covet. Slaves get a second mention in the part about not working on the Sabbath. Apparently God wants them to have a day off too. So the best thing that you can say about the 10 Commandments' position on slavery is that it's allowed, but give them one day off a week. There's nothing in there about universal human rights. Quite the opposite. Again, women are property and slaves are okay to keep. That's not universal human rights. It doesn't even mention governmental systems. How do you even get from any of the 10 Commandments to parliamentary democracy? Where does it say, "Thou shalt have a system of governance where the executive derives its democratic legitimacy from its ability to command the confidence of the legislature to which it is accountable"? That actually would have been quite impressive for a culture to have come up with for the time, but no, it shows no signs of being aware of any future systems of government.
As you will see when each of the 10 Commandments is explained, these commandments are as relevant today as when they were given over 3,000 years ago.
Oh, you're actually going to explain each of the 10 Commandments? That'll be a nice change. Most apologists just settle for mentioning the ones about murder and theft, with maybe the occasional reference to honoring parents and not coveting. It'll be nice to get to more than 40% of them for once.
In fact, they're so relevant that the 10 Commandments are all that is necessary to make a good world, a world free of tyranny and cruelty.
Oh, I very much beg to differ on that. Aside from the aforementioned approval of the practices of slavery and keeping women as property, there is no commandment against rape, nothing about equal rights for everyone without regards for things like race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc., nothing about child abuse, and I could go on. If those were the only rules in the world, then there are a lot of things there that are left up to the individual interpretation of those rules, and that never goes well. Hell, not even the Bible thinks that those 10 are the only 10 needed, otherwise it wouldn't have included the additional 603 commandments.
Imagine for a moment a world in which there was no murder or theft. In such a world, there would be no need for armies, or police, or weapons.
Because murder and theft are the only two possible crimes, I guess. You do know that you can give someone quite a severe beating without it rising to the level of murder, right? Do the 10 Commandments say not to beat people up? No. Does it say not to sell drugs to kids? No. And I don't know why you think that armies wouldn't be necessary. Do you really think that all international conflict would vanish if everybody adopted the Ten Commandments? You don't even seem to think that the commandment against killing is absolute, which is number 5 or 6, depending on which version we're going with. You advocate for the death penalty.
Keeping every murderer alive cheapens human life.
So clearly, thou shalt not kill has an implicit unless after it, in which you feel free to justify killing certain people depending on the circumstances. And also, let's be real here. If we're just going to pretend that everyone is going to follow the rules perfectly, then pretty much any country's core law code will do better than the Ten Commandments. And whatever lies you're willing to tell about the US founding to attempt to claim that it was founded on Judeo-Christian values, that is not true of, say, Japan. And yet, if everyone in the world were to suddenly just decide to obey all of Japan's laws, I'd wager that we'd end up with a much better world than if we scrapped all the laws and left it at just the Ten Commandments, with the same fantasy hypothetical where everybody obeys it.
Men and women and children could walk anywhere, at any time of day or night, without any fear of being killed or robbed.
Yeah, sure, in your little fantasy scenario, that would be great. But they still have no guarantee of not being assaulted or raped. I'm not sure how your utopia is supposed to, actually be a utopia when it doesn't take these very basic things into consideration.
Imagine further a world in which no one coveted what belonged to their neighbor.
So, communism? I thought you were against that, Dennis. You do realize that capitalism is based entirely on wanting things that other people have, right? I know in your propaganda you like to dress it up and pretend that everyone who has ever started a business did so purely out of the goodness of their hearts in order to look out for the welfare of others, and profits are simply a measurement of how well they have served their community. But again, that is a hypothetical fantasy world. That's not how reality works. In reality, capitalism works because people want more, and they will do what they can to get it. You ignore the corners that are cut to save costs and maximize profits. You ignore the exploitation of workers. You ignore a lot. But hey, this isn't about economic systems, this is about the Ten Commandments. It just so happens that capitalism goes directly against one of the commandments.
A world in which children honored their mother and father and the family unit thrived.
I mean, if we're taking that one to mean that all families have to be made up of one woman, one man, and their kids, then that kind of sucks, to be honest. Sounds like a pretty repressive society so far, everything from homophobia to an endorsement of the practice of slavery. Now, I don't think I like this world of yours at all.
A world in which people obeyed the injunction not to lie.
Well, this one is a bit wobbly. You see, there are most definitely places in the Bible that tell you not to lie, and that is certainly one potential interpretation of this particular text, but it actually says bear false witness against. This would be really easy to interpret as allowing lying, but not in a legal situation. In other words, don't lie to protect your friend who broke the law, or to falsely accuse someone of breaking the law when they didn't. And really, that's actually the preferable interpretation. Could you imagine if just lying in general were illegal? I lie to my kids all the time. They've actually told me that if I have a surprise for them, they would rather I just lie about it so that they don't expect anything than to tell them that I have a surprise for them, and I do this sometimes. Now, imagine if there were legal consequences for that. That would be horrifying. Flattery's out the window, nothing but brutal honesty from now on, or you go to prison. Flattery has been called the lubricant of social intercourse, but nope. From now on, when someone asks if that dress makes them look fat, if it does, the answer has to be yes, or you go to jail.
The recipe for a good world is all there in these 10 sublime commandments.
Hold up, you told me we were going to do all 10 of them. We've only got 5 so far. Granted, you did make it past 4, I think that might be a record, but we're only halfway there. If these commandments are so sublime, and they are really all we need for a utopian society, then why do you skip the ones that, well, for lack of a better way to say this, obviously have nothing to do with building a utopian society? You know, like the no graven images one, which could easily be interpreted as outlawing cameras, and by extension all Prager U videos? Or the no other gods before me one, which kind of flies in the face of that whole Judeo-Christian thing, does it not? Last I checked, Jews don't consider Jesus to be Yahweh, so being a Christian means putting another god before the Jewish God. And how about not taking God's name in vain? Is that necessary for a utopian society? No, absolutely not. We can have a good world without putting restrictions on saying God damn. But really, that's not even what this means, despite Christians taking it that way. It's even more obscure than that. It's more about God's actual name, Jehovah or Yahweh. If you are going to say the name, you'd better act in accordance with his code of conduct, basically. Or, alternately, this protects the whole swear to God thing, making it super duper against the rules to promise something while invoking God's name, and then to not follow through with that promise. But at the end of the day, no matter how it's interpreted, it has nothing to do with how society should be run. How about remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy? It could be argued that this is to make sure that everyone gets a day off, but using stuff like science, we've learned that giving workers adequate time off and shorter workdays actually improves productivity, so it seems like a 5-day work week with a 6-hour work day is the sweet spot for improving efficiency and mental health. So God's layout will result in overworked, tired, inefficient workers. And interestingly, you also chose to leave out the adultery one, which I would agree doesn't belong in a legal code, as it is a purely personal matter, but usually apologists are happy to trot that one out as if it's an obviously moral thing to legislate, when in reality the legislation of adultery is entirely unjustified meddling in personal affairs. Pun intended, obviously.
But there is a catch.
Is the catch that you just described an unrealistic utopia that even if we did follow its rules to the letter would still actually end up being a dystopia because of all the obvious rules that it doesn't have?
The Ten Commandments are predicated on the belief that they were given by an authority higher than any man, any king, or any government.
Sure. A belief that not everybody shares, and a lot of people have come up with better lists of 10 rules than the ones in the Bible without the help of a higher power, so that leaves me wondering if the higher power part is even necessary.
That's why the sentence preceding the Ten Commandments asserts the following: God spoke all these words.
Funny thing about that, after Moses came down the mountain and smashed the tablets because he was mad that the Israelites had broken the rules that they didn't know they had yet, God rewrote the commandments on new tablets. He didn't speak it this time, he wrote it himself with his own finger? Does God have fingers?
Do fish have fingers?
Anyway, my point is, it explicitly states that he is writing the same words that were on the first tablet. So let's quickly go through the other 10 Commandments, which also happens to be the only set of 10 Commandments that the Bible actually calls the 10 Commandments. And these are the ones that were written on the tablets by God himself, and these tablets went into the Ark of the Covenant. So obviously they are the most important ones, right? Anyway, number 1. Do not make a covenant with the people that live in the land you're going to. In fact, tear down all their altars and shit. 2. Don't worship other gods. 3. Don't marry people from different tribes. 4. Don't make gods out of cast metal. 5. Keep the feast of unleavened bread. 6. All that open the womb are gods. He gets all the firstborn, including human babies, which could be interpreted as human sacrifice. 7. Rest on the Sabbath. 8. Observe the Feast of Weeks. 9. 3 times a year, your menfolk will have to go appear before God. 10. Don't offer the blood of God's sacrifice with anything leavened, because God fucking hates yeast for some reason. 11. Leftovers from the Passover are bad. Don't keep them. 12. The best of the first fruits of your ground go to God. 13. And finally, the infamous don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. Now, you might have noticed that their list of 10 commandments is longer than 10 commandments. It's not very clear, it could be broken up in different ways, but it definitely says in the text that these are the 10 commandments. Anyway, my point is that this is the final draft of the 10 commandments, the important copy, and not a single item on the list is in any way an important principle for basing a society's legal code on. No wonder apologists prefer the rough draft. My point here is that you're making a big deal about it saying that God spoke those commandments, but these ones are supposed to be the same, but also handwritten by God and placed in the Ark of the Covenant, so if we have to choose between the two of them based on which ones God thinks are more important, this one should win. But you're not interested in using what God clearly thinks are the superior commandments. You evaluate them with your own moral code and decide for yourself which ones you prefer, and so you hype up the earlier set as if they didn't have a shitty reboot that is the official canon now.
You see, if the Ten Commandments, as great as they are, were given by any human authority, then any person could say, who is this man Moses? Who is this king or queen? Who is this government to tell me how I should behave?
And we can say the same thing of God. Who is this God to tell me how to behave? Why is his opinion more important than mine when it comes to morality? And, more to the point, why does Dennis think that his opinion is more important than God's when it comes to the Ten Commandments? Why are you using the outdated version, Dennis? That's not what God would want.
Okay, so why is God indispensable to the Ten Commandments?
Because he said he is. Duh.
Because, to put it as directly as possible, if it isn't God who declares murder wrong, murder isn't wrong.
Why? Like, really, why? Why is murder okay if God isn't the one saying it's wrong? Why does God saying it's wrong automatically make it wrong? Why do God's morals take precedence over human morals? Generally, apologists tend to answer this one with something along the lines of saying that morality is objective, and God is the source of that objective standard for morality, which doesn't actually follow. That would just be subjective morality with God imposing his personal subjective morality on us. Either morality is actually objective and comes from outside God, and so also applies to God, or morality comes from God and so is subjective, with God's subjective opinion winning through nothing more than might makes right. Or morality comes from a careful evaluation of desired outcomes, and so we can figure out which actions are moral or immoral based on how well they do with getting us closer to or farther away from those desired outcomes. So if, for instance, maximizing well-being and minimizing harm is the desired outcome, then murder is wrong. My question for you, though, Death Row Dennis, is how is it that murder is wrong, but murdering the murderer is not wrong?
Keeping every murderer alive cheapens human life.
Seems like you're okay with killing if the circumstances are right. But in our little hypothetical here, we're just looking at the Ten Commandments, nothing else. They don't carve out an exception for killing people that have killed other people, it just says not to kill. And quite frankly, if the only reason you think that killing people is wrong is because someone else told you that it's wrong, then by all means keep believing that the person who can make you not kill people is real.
Yes, this strikes many people today as incomprehensible, even absurd.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's incomprehensible or absurd, more like arbitrary. Why does morality not come from a king? Because God is more powerful than a king. So why does morality come from God? Because he's the most powerful. Might makes right. To me, this says that you don't want to put any effort into thinking about morals, you just want someone to tell you what is moral. Morality by divine imposition. But of course God won't tell you what he thinks is moral for himself, so who tells us what God really thinks is moral? Sure, the easy answer here is the Bible, because that's the word of God. Well, I guess Dennis is Jewish, so he'd probably be more inclined to answer with the Torah. But as we've already seen here a few times, even with the most basic list of 10 rules that, if followed, will supposedly create the Prager socialist utopia, we run into problems of interpretation. Does not bearing false witness only apply to giving legal testimony, or is it about lying in general? Does not killing only apply to private citizens, leaving the government free to participate in war and capital punishment? Does the part where it says not to make a graven image or a likeness of anything that is in heaven, earth, or water mean that all art that represents real things is now off limits? Or is it just with reference to the stuff that is explicitly for the purpose of worshipping? God doesn't seem to be keen on clarifying this for us, so who does the clarifying, Dennis? Historically, it's been the people who run the church and the people who run the government. So kings and popes and all the other people that you said we don't get our morals from. Your system literally leads us to looking to these very human and fallible authorities as the source for our morality, based on their interpretation of God's word. My system of having a moral goal and assessing the morality of an action based on its actual outcome allows for the questioning of these supposed authorities in order to arrive at an actual moral conclusion.
Many of you are thinking, is this guy saying you can't be a good person if you don't believe in God?
Oh, I'm sorry, I guess I had the wrong objection there. Go ahead, have at the straw man.
Let me respond as clearly as possible. I am not saying that. Of course there are good people who don't believe in God, just as there are bad people who do.
Almost like God really isn't the source of morality or something.
And many of you are also thinking I believe murder is wrong. I don't need God to tell me.
Well, that's closer to the actual objection. Yay, progress?
Now, that response is only half true. I have no doubt that if you're an atheist and you say that you believe murder is wrong, you believe murder is wrong. But forgive me, you do need God to tell you.
No, I really don't. Remember that whole minimize harm, maximize well-being thing? That's not God.
We all need God to tell us. You see, even if you figured out murder is wrong on your own, without God and the Ten Commandments, how do you know it's wrong? Not believe it's wrong, I mean know it's wrong.
Because you can measure the outcomes associated with murder and find that they are almost always undesirable. And the times when they are desirable are the times that we just happen to have carved out legal exceptions that allow it. Things like self-defense. This ain't rocket science.
The fact is, you can't.
I literally just explained it in 15 seconds.
Because without God, right and wrong are just personal beliefs, personal opinions.
How does God's presence make that any different? It's just that it's God's personal beliefs and opinions now.
I think shoplifting is okay, you don't. Unless there is a God, all morality is just opinion and belief.
Again, that just doesn't follow. You use the example of shoplifting. That's stealing. Yeah, God says thou shalt not steal in the Exodus 20 version of the Ten Commandments, but the first commandment in the final version of the Ten Commandments is to not make covenants with the people whose land you are stealing. So God's opinion in Exodus 20 is that stealing is wrong, but his opinion in Exodus 34 is that stealing is okay as long as you're stealing from the people that he told you to steal from. Why does God get to change his mind on these moral issues? Is it wrong, or is it not wrong? I can measure the outcomes and say that stealing from the other tribes would have been morally wrong based on the negative outcomes. You somehow have to come up with excuses as to why it was okay in that instance, and that's what apologists always do with problematic Bible passages like this. They say things like, but the Canaanites were practicing child sacrifice, in an attempt to justify the immoral act of genocide. They try to present the situation in a way that would have the outcomes be worse than the heinous actions that God commanded or committed, because they know that our morality comes from a combination of empathy and the measurement of outcomes, a harm versus well-being analysis. When you make excuses for why God's actions in the Bible are moral, you are borrowing from secular morality to make those determinations. The hate preachers like Steven Anderson, who just flat out state that it's moral because God said so and that makes it moral, no thinking required, are more honest than the people who try to come up with excuses that make it seem more moral to us. So, Dennis, the moral system that you are advocating for leads us to people like Steven Anderson. Secular morality leads us to measurably better outcomes. Secular morality is superior here.
Another problem with the view that you don't need God to believe that murder is wrong is a lot of people haven't shared your view.
Yeah, and that's where this empathy thing comes in. Because, like it or not, our morality actually is based pretty much entirely on feelings. Sure, we can do the whole measure outcomes thing, but most people don't actively think about it. They're just winging it. But also, being a social species, cooperation helps with the survival of the species. So things like empathy were selected for, which then led to morality. And this is all stuff that we see animals doing too. Did God give the different animals 10 commandments? Do the 10 commandments for goats contain a commandment against letting those naked ape things boil your kids in your milk?
And you don't have to go back very far in history to prove this. In the 20th century, millions of people in communist societies and under Nazism killed about 100 million people. And that doesn't count a single soldier killed in war.
And do you really think the death toll would have been any lower had the people who were behind the Christian Crusades had access to the same technology and sheer numbers of people as the communist and fascist regimes? They killed as many Muslims as they could, and the Muslims killed as many of them as they could. Seems like power-hungry leaders are intent on killing people that don't belong to the same in-group as them, religion or no. And also, say what you will about Hitler's personal beliefs, but he definitely used Christianity as a means to achieving his extermination goals. It wasn't the Allies in World War II that had God with us written on their belt buckles.
So don't get too confident about people's ability to figure out right from wrong without a higher authority.
Oh, quite the contrary. You think those people were not using their authority to impose their lack of morals? Those are perfect examples of why morality from authority is the most dangerous kind of morality that there is.
It's all too easy to be swayed by a government or a demagogue or an ideology, or to rationalize that the wrong you're doing isn't really wrong.
Do you even hear yourself? What do you think religion is if not an ideology? Like I said, you can claim it all you want, but the fact of the matter is that, no matter how you slice it, you do not get your morality directly from God. You seem to be getting your morality from a particular interpretation of a book that you claim to be the Word of God, but that book can and has been interpreted in many different ways, many of which are obviously immoral. And who is in charge of deciding which interpretations are the correct interpretations? Historically, this has been the governments, demagogues, and people with particular ideologies. So, all the people you just said we should not be getting morality from.
And even if you do figure out what is right and wrong, God is still necessary. People who know the difference between right and wrong do the wrong thing all the time.
Which is why your utopia of a world based on the Ten Commandments is entirely unrealistic. It doesn't make God a necessary part of the equation, though.
You know why? Because they can. They can because they think no one is watching.
Yeah, that's the only reason anyone has ever had for doing something wrong. Nobody's ever killed someone to protect a loved one. They just thought they could get away with it. Nobody ever stole food because they were hungry. They just didn't think anyone would see them do it. No, sorry, adding Big Brother to the scenario does not help your case.
But if you recognize that God is the source of moral law, you believe that He is always watching.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
So the only reason you don't do things like murder people or steal things is because you think you're being watched? This says a lot about you, Dennis. It really is quite telling.
So even if you're an atheist, you would want people to live by the moral laws of the Ten Commandments.
No, I really wouldn't. Definitely not the final copy, but even the rough draft that apologists present as though they were the definitive version leaves a lot to be desired. 4 of the commandments are just wasted on things that are unhelpful at best and dangerous if they are actually legislated. Just because I happen to agree with some of them does not mean that I would agree that everyone should live by all of them. If we're talking laws, there are really only 2 that belong on the books, maybe 3. Don't kill, don't steal, and don't bear false witness. With that last one only belonging on the law books in the sense that it means not bearing false witness in legal matters. The other ones that I might agree with, the other one that I agree with, not committing adultery, is a personal matter and is none of the government's business, and so should not be on the law books. Honoring your parents sounds nice at face value, and sure, I would like my kids to have a healthy respect for me, but there are a lot of shitty parents out there that don't deserve to be honored just because they had unprotected sex at least once. And this is something that we recognize as a society. That's why family and children's services exist.
And even an atheist has to admit that the more people who believe God gave them, and therefore they are not just opinion, the better the world would be.
No, absolutely not. Without question, the world would be a better place if more people would figure out morality by considering the consequences of their actions rather than thinking things are right or wrong based on divine command. Divine command is how you get otherwise good moral people to do bad things.
In 3,000 years, no one has ever come up with a better system than the God-based 10 Commandments for making a better world, and no one ever will.
Well, that's a nice subjective opinion you've got there, Dennis, but you're wrong. That's it for this one. Guess this is another one that doesn't actually list all 10 of the 10 Commandments. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Lady Shay, who says, I love science, but I think is about as much of a red flag as I'm not a racist, but. I couldn't agree more. The but indicates that you're about to say something that contradicts the first part of the statement. A handy way to measure the impact that a but has on a statement is to replace it with the word and see what changes. Also, teehee, but impact. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the 10 commandments that dictate the behavior of my channel. If you'd like to really be 13 to 15 commandments and still be called 10, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to my social media and all the ways to support the channel and to my other projects like my podcast with my daughter can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time.